Blood on a silk blouse is impossible to wash out, but a mistranslated threat in the criminal underworld is a guaranteed death sentence. When Sicily's most ruthless female boss walked into a tense New York sit-down, she expected a bloodbath. She never expected the waitress who understood her deadliest secrets. The private dining room at Russo's Prime in Manhattan was a fortress of mahogany, cigar smoke, and suffocating tension. For decades, it had been neutral ground for the five families, a place where multi-million-dollar shipping routes were divided over plates of veal scallopini. Tonight, however, the air in the room was brittle enough to snap. Charlie Harrington stood quietly in the corner, her white apron starched perfectly against her black uniform. At 26, she was just trying to survive the crushing debt her estranged father had left behind. She kept her head down, her eyes on the expensive crystal glasses, and her mouth shut. In a room full of made men, a waitress was supposed to be a ghost. At the head of the long table sat Carmine Rossi, a heavy-set, brutal man who controlled the Brooklyn docks. He was flanked by his capos, men with thick necks and tailored suits who laughed too loudly at his jokes. But all of Charlie's attention and the crushing gravity of the room was anchored to the woman sitting directly across from Carmine. Vittoria D'Agostino, the undisputed head of the Sicilian syndicate, operating out of Palermo. Vittoria was a striking, terrifying presence. She wore an immaculate ivory pantsuit that contrasted sharply with her dark, piercing eyes, and the sleek, raven hair pulled into a severe knot at the nape of her neck. She didn't fidget. She didn't smile. She just watched Carmine with the predatory stillness of a hawk. Because Vittoria D'Agostino famously refused to speak English during business negotiations, she had brought her own translator, a nervous, sweating man named Arthur, who looked like he was one dropped fork away from a heart attack. "Listen to me, sweetheart," Carmine said, leaning forward, his massive hands resting on the white tablecloth. "The shipping containers coming through Newark? That's my territory now. The old arrangements died with your uncle. You want to move your product through my ports, you pay a 30% tax. Non-negotiable." Arthur, trembling, turned to Vittoria and translated Carmine's words into standard, polite Italian. Vittoria's expression didn't change. She took a slow sip of her Barolo. Then, she leaned back and spoke. It wasn't standard Italian. It was a rapid, guttural, fiercely localized Sicilian dialect. It was the specific, gravelly tongue of the mountain villages near Trapani, mixed with old underworld slang. It was a language built for secrecy, historically used by the Cosa Nostra to baffle wiretaps and outsiders. Charlie, standing by the wine bucket, froze. She understood every single word. Charlie's grandmother, Nonna Maria, had fled that exact mountainous region of Sicily in the 1970s to escape a brutal mafia war. She had raised Charlie on those stories and that exact dialect, refusing to let the old language die. To anyone else in the room, Vittoria sounded like she was speaking in tongues. To Charlie, it was as clear as English. "Tell this fat pig," Vittoria had said in the dialect, her voice dripping with venom, "that if he tries to tax my ships, I will have his sons gutted like fish and left on his doorstep by morning. And tell him I know he is stealing from the Union Pension Fund." Charlie inhaled sharply, her hand tightening around the neck of a wine bottle. Arthur, the translator, went visibly pale. He swallowed hard, adjusting his collar. He looked at Carmine's imposing enforcers, then back at Vittoria. He was terrified of delivering that message. He was a coward trying to play peacemaker in a room full of wolves. "Miss D'Agostino says..." Arthur stammered in English, his voice cracking. "She says, she respects your position, Mr. Rossi, but she feels 30% is a bit steep, and hopes we can negotiate a fairer tariff." Charlie's eyes widened. She stared at Arthur. "That is not what she said." Carmine smirked, leaning back in his leather chair, looking triumphant. He thought he had the legendary Vittoria D'Agostino backing down. "See? That's what I like to hear. A reasonable woman. Tell her I can drop it to 28% as a courtesy." Arthur quickly translated Carmine's response back into standard Italian. Vittoria's eyes narrowed slightly. She caught the smugness on Carmine's face. She knew something was wrong. Her message of absolute war had somehow resulted in a relaxed, victorious smile from her enemy. Vittoria spoke again, her dialect faster, sharper, and utterly lethal. I did not fly across the Atlantic to negotiate pennies with a street thug. Tell him he has 24 hours to release my seized cargo, or I will burn his warehouses to ash with him inside. Arthur wiped sweat from his forehead with a napkin. She asks for a few days to consider your generous offer, Mr. Rossi. The betrayal was complete. Arthur was intentionally softening her words, likely bribed by Carmine's men beforehand, or simply too cowardly to translate a death threat. Either way, Vittoria was being played for a fool in front of the most powerful men in New York. Charlie couldn't take it. The injustice of it, the sheer danger Vittoria was in without realizing her own mouthpiece was a traitor, made Charlie's pulse hammer in her ears. Before she could stop herself, before her brain could scream at her to stay invisible, Charlie stepped forward. Her foot caught the edge of the heavy wooden chair. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. All eyes snapped to the waitress in the corner. The room fell, dead silent. Carmine's underbosses glared at her. Arthur looked annoyed at the interruption. But Vittoria D'Agostino's gaze locked onto Charlie, sharp and calculating. "My apologies," Charlie whispered, her cheeks burning. She quickly moved to the table to pour more water, desperate to fade back into the background. She reached for Vittoria's glass, her hand shaking slightly. As Charlie poured the water, Vittoria watched her intently. The Mafia boss leaned in, and in a low, quiet voice, spoke in that same impenetrable mountain dialect. "The translator is lying to me, isn't he, little mouse?" "You flinched when I spoke." Charlie's breath hitched. She froze, the water pitcher hovering over the crystal glass. She wasn't supposed to answer. She was a waitress. If she admitted she understood, she was stepping into a war zone. But Vittoria's eyes held a terrifying, magnetic command. Without looking up, Charlie whispered back in the exact same flawless, gravelly Trapani dialect. "He is not just lying to you, Signora. He is selling you out. He told them you are begging for a negotiation." Vittoria's posture didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. A dark, dangerous amusement flickered in the Sicilian boss's eyes. She had found a weapon she didn't know she possessed. Vittoria abruptly stood up. The scraping of her chair echoed like a gunshot. Carmine's men instantly tensed, their hands hovering near their tailored jackets. "Arthur," Vittoria said in heavily accented, but perfectly clear English. It was the first time she had spoken English all night. The entire table looked shocked. "You are dismissed." Arthur blinked, confused. "Signora? I don't understand." Vittoria casually picked up her steak knife. "Leave this room in the next 5 seconds, Arthur, before I nail your lying tongue to this table. You are dead to me. Walk away." Arthur didn't need translation. He scrambled backward, practically tripping over his own feet, and bolted out the heavy mahogany doors. Carmine stood up, his face red with sudden anger. "What the hell is this, Vittoria? You pull this stunt in my city? You fire your translator in the middle of a sit-down?" "I don't need a traitor," Vittoria said coldly. She turned slowly and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at Charlie, who was shrinking back against the wall. "I will use her." Carmine let out a loud, mocking laugh. "The waitress? Are you out of your mind?" "She serves breadsticks, Vittoria. She doesn't speak a word of Italian." "She speaks my language," Vittoria replied, her eyes never leaving Charlie. She gestured toward the empty chair beside her. "Sit down, little mouse. Tell them exactly who I am." Charlie's legs felt like lead. Every survival instinct she had screamed at her to run through the kitchen doors and never look back. But the absolute authority in Vittoria's voice left no room for refusal. Trembling, Charlie walked over and sat in the plush leather chair next to the most dangerous woman in Europe. Carmine glared at Charlie. "Listen to me, girl. You pour the wine and you keep your mouth shut, or you won't make it home to your miserable apartment tonight." Vittoria didn't even look at Carmine. She spoke to Charlie in the rapid, ancient dialect, her voice ringing with deadly authority. "Tell him his threat means nothing. Tell him my grandfather killed better men for less. Tell him that if my cargo is not released by midnight, I will personally see to it that the docks run red with his blood, and the Rossi family will be erased from history." Charlie swallowed hard. She looked at Carmine Rossi. She wasn't a mobster. She was a girl drowning in debt, working double shifts. But as she translated Vittoria's words, she channeled the fierce pride of her grandmother. "Miss D'Agostino says," Charlie began, her voice shaking at first, but steadying with every word. That your threats are meaningless. Her ancestors have destroyed greater men than you, over lesser insults. Charlie locked eyes with Carmine, adopting Vittoria's icy stare. She says if her cargo isn't released by midnight, the Brooklyn docks will run red with your blood, and the Rossi family name will be entirely erased from history. The silence that followed was deafening. Carmine's face drained of color. His capos shifted uneasily. The raw, unfiltered brutality of Vittoria's true threat, delivered through the soft voice of a terrified waitress, was utterly chilling. Carmine opened his mouth to shout, to order his men to draw their weapons, but Vittoria slammed her hand on the table. "Tell him the meeting is over," Vittoria ordered Charlie. "And tell him to pay the bill." "The meeting is over," Charlie translated flawlessly, standing up alongside the Mafia boss. "And she expects you to cover the check." Without another glance at the stunned Americans, Vittoria turned on her heel and walked toward the door. Her bodyguards seamlessly fell into step behind her. Just as she reached the exit, Vittoria paused. She looked back at Charlie, who was standing frozen by the table, waiting for the fallout. "You," Vittoria said in English, snapping her fingers. "Grab your coat." Charlie blinked. "Excuse me? You don't work here anymore," Vittoria stated, her dark eyes flashing with a mix of possessiveness and intrigue. "You work for me now. The car is waiting outside. 5 minutes." Vittoria walked out, leaving Charlie standing in a room full of furious mobsters. Charlie had a choice: stay and face the wrath of the Rossi family, or walk out the door and into the terrifying, intoxicating shadow of the Sicilian Mafia boss. Charlie took off her apron, dropped it on Carmine Rossi's empty plate, and walked out the door. The black Maybach slid through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan like a predator in the deep ocean. Inside the soundproof cabin, the silence between Charlie and Vittoria D'Agostino was heavy enough to crush coal into diamonds. Charlie pressed herself against the cold leather of the passenger door, clutching her cheap trench coat over her waitress uniform. She had just walked away from her only source of income, stepping blindly into the gravitational pull of the Sicilian underworld. Vittoria poured herself a measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter in the center console. She didn't offer Charlie any. Instead, she evaluated the younger woman with eyes as sharp and cold as obsidian. "Your accent," Vittoria finally spoke, her English flawless but laced with a dangerous edge. "It is pure Trapanese, not the watered-down garbage they speak in Palermo today, but the old tongue, the language of the mountains. Where did you learn it, little mouse?" "My grandmother," Charlie whispered, her voice trembling slightly over the hum of the luxury car's engine. "She grew up in a village near Erisay. She fled to America in 1978, she told me. She told me the old language was the only thing the men in suits couldn't steal from her." A flicker of something resembling respect crossed Vittoria's stoic face. Ninetayant 78, the first Mafia war. She survived the slaughter of the old families. Vittoria took a slow sip of her drink. She must have been a very tough woman. "It seems it skipped a generation. Considering you were trembling while pouring water for a Brooklyn street thug." Charlie's jaw tightened. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but indignation sparked in her chest. "I was a waitress making $9 an hour plus tips. You're a billionaire who runs a crime syndicate. I think my trembling was statistically justified, Miss D'Agostino." Vittoria's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile. "Vittoria, you will call me Vittoria. And starting tomorrow, you will no longer worry about $9 an hour." Over the next 3 months, Charlie's life became an unrecognizable, terrifying luxury. She was moved into Vittoria's private estate in Oyster Bay, a sprawling, fortress-like mansion heavily guarded by men who spoke little and carried concealed automatics. Charlie was officially given the title of cultural attaché, but in reality, she became Vittoria's shadow. She was the absolute filter for the Sicilian boss. Vittoria weaponized Charlie's linguistic skills, using her to intercept whispered conversations in back rooms, decode the subtle inflections of rival capos, and sift through intercept recordings provided by Vittoria's private intelligence network. To make the operation legitimate, Vittoria funneled her vast wealth through a labyrinth of shell companies, specifically Apex Global Logistics and the Hudson Yards Development Group. Charlie quickly learned that the modern mafia didn't just use guns. They used offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, high-frequency trading, and corporate real estate to launder billions. But the closer Charlie got to the inner workings of the syndicate, the closer she got to Vittoria. The terrifying mafia boss was ruthless, yes, but she was also deeply isolated. In the quiet hours of the night, long after the capos and the bodyguards had retired, Vittoria would call Charlie into her private study. Surrounded by centuries-old Italian literature and the glow of a crackling fireplace, the hardened boss would drop her guard. They would converse entirely in the old dialect. Sharing stories of the homeland, neither could truly return to safely. It was during these late-night sessions that the lines between employer and employee began to violently blur. Charlie caught herself staring at the elegant curve of Vittoria's neck, the intense focus in her dark eyes when she worked. Vittoria, in turn, began to fiercely protect Charlie. When a visiting European associate looked at Charlie a second too long, Vittoria calmly broke his fingers with a marble paperweight, explaining it was a cultural misunderstanding. But the idyllic, dangerous bubble they had built was about to burst. Carmine, the Brooklyn boss, had not forgotten the humiliation at Russo's prime. He had quietly been losing territory, and his bleeding pride demanded a response. More terrifyingly, Charlie began to notice discrepancies in the internal communications of Vittoria's own men. It happened on a Tuesday. Vittoria's trusted lieutenant, Dominic, handed Charlie a ledger detailing a shipment of heavy machinery arriving at the port of Newark. As Charlie cross-referenced the documents, her eyes caught a subtle, almost invisible note, hastily scribbled in the margins of the manifest, a string of numbers that matched the routing code for a front company owned by Carmine's syndicate. Dominic was selling them out. "Vittoria," Charlie said, her heart hammering against her ribs as she burst into the boss's office, bypassing the armed guards. "The meeting tonight at the Red Hook warehouses." "You can't go." Vittoria looked up from her mahogany desk, her expression unreadable. "It is a standard inspection of my goods, Charlie. I do not cancel meetings." "It's a trap," Charlie pleaded, slamming the ledger onto the desk. Dominic altered the shipping manifest. He routed the secondary security team to the wrong pier. "Carmine's men are waiting for you. If you walk into that warehouse, you are dead." Vittoria stared at the ledger, her dark eyes tracing the routing numbers. The air in the room turned to ice. She didn't shout. She didn't throw anything. The absolute stillness of her rage was infinitely more terrifying. "Dominic has been with my family for 15 years, Vittoria said softly, her voice a deadly whisper. "And Carmine bought him," Charlie insisted, stepping closer, desperately grabbing Vittoria's arm. "Please, believe me." Vittoria looked down at Charlie's hand resting on her expensive suit. Then, she looked into Charlie's eyes. "I believe you, my little mouse. But a queen does not hide in her castle when rats are in the walls. She sets a trap of her own." The Red Hook warehouse district was shrouded in a thick, freezing fog that smelled of salt and decaying fish. The massive steel doors of Pier 44 stood slightly ajar. Vittoria D'Agostino arrived in a convoy of 3 black SUVs, exactly on time. But she had made one crucial change to the plan. She had not brought Dominic. Instead, she had forced Charlie to sit in the armored vehicle beside her, dressed not as a translator, but in a tailored black suit that mirrored Vittoria's own. "Stay low," Vittoria commanded, drawing a sleek, suppressed 9mm pistol from her jacket. "Do exactly as I say, and do not leave my sight." As Vittoria and her 4 most loyal enforcers stepped into the cavernous, dimly lit warehouse, the trap was sprung. Floodlights violently snapped on, blinding them. From the catwalks above, and the shadows behind the shipping containers, heavily armed men, loyal to Carmine, opened fire. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire ripped through the warehouse. The concrete pillars around them exploded into dust and shrapnel. Vittoria's guards instantly returned fire, forming a protective wall around their boss, but they were vastly outnumbered. "Move!" Vittoria shouted, grabbing Charlie by the collar and dragging her behind a massive steel shipping crate as bullets sparked and whined off the metal. One of Vittoria's men dropped, a red bloom exploding on his chest. The situation was deteriorating by the second. Carmine's men were advancing, flanking their position. "They're going to trap us," Charlie gasped, her ears ringing from the concussive blasts. She looked around frantically, Her eyes locked onto an old, rusted control panel 10 feet away, attached to the warehouse's heavy industrial crane system. The crane was currently suspending a multi-ton shipping container directly over the central aisle where Carmine's men were advancing. "Victoria!" Charlie yelled over the gunfire. She pointed at the control panel. "The magnetic release. If I can hit the emergency override, it will drop the container on them." Victoria assessed the distance. 10 feet of open ground, completely exposed to sniper fire from the catwalks. "It is suicide. You stay here." "I'm not a waitress anymore," Charlie screamed back, her fear entirely eclipsed by the desperate need to keep the woman she had fallen for alive. Before Victoria could physically stop her, Charlie bolted from cover. Time seemed to slow down. Bullets chewed up the concrete at Charlie's feet. A piece of flying shrapnel sliced a deep, burning gash across her cheek. But she didn't stop. She dove hard, sliding across the dusty floor, and slammed her hand onto the massive red emergency release button on the console. A loud, mechanical groan echoed through the warehouse. The massive electromagnets holding the suspended shipping container instantly disengaged. 30 tons of reinforced steel plummeted from the ceiling. It crashed onto the warehouse floor with the force of an earthquake, instantly crushing the advancing front line of Carmine's men and throwing a massive cloud of concrete dust into the air. The resulting shockwave knocked the remaining shooters off their feet. Capitalizing on the chaos, Victoria stepped out from cover. She moved with terrifying, lethal precision, firing methodically into the dust cloud. Every shot found its mark. Within 60 seconds, the ambush was entirely broken. The surviving Brooklyn hitmen threw down their weapons and fled into the fog. The warehouse fell dead silent, save for the hiss of broken steam pipes. Victoria immediately dropped her weapon and ran to the control panel. Charlie was slumped against the console, clutching her bleeding cheek, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. Victoria fell to her knees, her immaculate suit ruined by the dust and blood on the floor. Her hands, usually so steady, shook as she cupped Charlie's face, examining the deep cut. "You foolish, brave, beautiful girl," Victoria breathed, her voice cracking for the first time since Charlie had met her. She switched to their private dialect. "You could have died. Why did you run?" Charlie leaned into Victoria's touch, her adrenaline fading, leaving her exhausted but remarkably clear-headed. "Because I belong to you now, and you belong to me. I wasn't going to let them take my queen." Victoria's eyes darkened with raw, undeniable emotion. Right there, surrounded by the wreckage and the bodies of their enemies, the Mafia boss leaned down and pressed her lips fiercely against Charlie's. It was a kiss that tasted of gunpowder, blood, and absolute, possessive devotion. The fallout from the Red Hook massacre was swift and brutal. But Victoria didn't retaliate with just bullets. She used the intelligence Charlie had gathered. Within 48 hours, an anonymous, highly encrypted package was delivered to the FBI's Southern District of New York field office. It contained the unredacted ledgers Dominic had tried to alter, exposing the entirety of the Brooklyn Syndicate's money laundering operations, their political bribes, and their extortion rackets. The RICO indictments came down like a hammer. The FBI raided Carmine's operations across all 5 boroughs. Stripped of his wealth, his political protection, and his men, the Brooklyn boss was completely neutralized, locked in a federal penitentiary awaiting trial for the rest of his natural life. Dominic, the traitor, simply vanished. He was never seen again. 6 months later, the private dining room at a newly acquired, ultra-exclusive restaurant in Manhattan was perfectly silent. The heavy mahogany table was set for 2. Vittoria D'Agostino sat at the head of the table, dressed in a stunning, midnight blue evening gown. But she was no longer the only boss in the room. Charlie walked in, wearing a sharp, tailored white suit that contrasted beautifully with her dark hair. The scar on her cheek was a thin, pale line, a badge of honor that commanded respect from every capo in the D'Agostino family. She wasn't carrying a water pitcher. She was carrying the newly signed deeds to the Brooklyn docks. Charlie took her seat at the opposite end of the table, a confident, dangerous smile playing on her lips. She poured herself a glass of the vintage Barolo. "The transition is complete," Charlie said smoothly, raising her glass. "The ports are ours. The old blood is gone." Victoria smiled, a soft, genuine expression reserved only for the woman sitting across from her. She raised her own glass. To the future, Vittoria said, speaking perfect English. To us, Charlie replied, answering seamlessly in the ancient, gravelly Sicilian dialect. The waitress was dead. The new queen of the empire had taken her throne. Want more gripping, real-life drama and heart-pounding plot twists? If you loved this story of power, betrayal, and dark romance, hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow story lovers. And absolutely smash that subscribe button. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. We have brand new, intense storytelling scripts coming your way every single week.